just typing that word makes me cringe. I mean, by no means am I a purist. In fact, I don't even call myself a printer, but I do print, and I respect the knowledge of the history of printing as a way of a means to an end. It's kind of the way I feel about etiquette. You have to know the rules in order to know how to break the rules. And as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that's really important about stationery, besides the fact that it serves its primary function, it has the right names on it, has the right date on it, all that kind of stuff. The only other thing that matters is the impact that that piece has on the person it's given to. But otherwise, I tend to not really care how people talk about stationery, except I need to be able to talk to my clients about the practical parts too, about how the stationery is going to look. My ideal clients trust me to bring that impact to them, but that doesn't mean they don't want to be involved in the process or at least know what it's going to look like. And so the terms of printing are important in that regard. And as such, this emboss deboss thing has just completely driven me nuts for the last few years. The challenge is this. Well, let me back up and say, before I made this video, I did what any good armchair expert does and went to Wikipedia and went to see what it had to say. Deboss is this term that people use to mean something that it doesn't actually mean. I was under the impression before I started doing some research that deboss was a completely modern term, like last decade or so, and that before that the term didn't exist. It appears to me, through a very quick search, that there is some evidence to support that the idea of a deboss is something that has existed for a while in printing. The challenge is most people use the term deboss, particularly other stationers, use the term deboss to mean something other than what it does. Also, I don't know where to put the accent there. Is it deboss or Embossing is the act of raising paper through use of a die and a counter. Now these are a mess. They've been sitting in the studio for a long time. I tend to not keep most of my dies around for a while, so most of them have been taken to the scrapyard and recycled already. But I do happen to have this matching pair so far, and they've experienced rain and a bunch of other stuff. But the idea here is that is the emboss. That is the raised, reversed, you'll notice that it's in reverse, art. And then this is a counter. Now I can make my own counter, I could pour it, I could use paper, but when I get counters from my die maker, they tend to give me a cleaner emboss. What those two things together do is raise the surface of the card to fill in that emboss in the die. And so that's simply what an emboss is. Now you'll notice that's a blind emboss. That means it has no color at all. There is not, as far as I know, a way to create a true emboss that has ink applied directly to the emboss. If you see a lot of direct mail and kind of fancier mass-produced print work is done where they'll do 4-color print, which is just standard full color, and then they'll go do a blind emboss over that. I can do that with foil, I can do that with letterpress, I can do that with offset or digital printing too. So you'll see that really often, but there is no way through this die to actually transfer ink to the paper. The other thing that an embossing die can do is this is actually what's called a combo embossing die, or combination embossing die. You will notice, by the way, that the dies that I have here are all brass. That's because the ones that I have kept around were, frankly, the more expensive dies to produce. They were what's called sculpted embossing dies. That means that a 3D model of the end result was created, and from that a CNC machine sculpted these dies to give them depth. You can see that that is a lot different than a project like this, where the whole thing is just raised all to the same height. That is an etched embossing die. It look very much like this wax seal die does, where everything is etched to a specific depth. So this particular die is really interesting because in addition to cutting out the parts that were going to be embossed, which is this very tiny, very fine pattern here, you'll also see that they cut out around the die because this is what's called a combination die. This die I can actually foil stamp and emboss at the same time. And the very edges of each piece are created to have a sharp edge that creates a sharp line for the foil. And what that created was the white part here, which has a very slight emboss with it that you can see particularly in the larger areas. These couple larger fish, you'll see it, and you'll see in the back you'll see a little bit of deformation there because that was truly embossed. Now, the larger the area, the deeper the emboss can be. The finer the lines are, the shallower the depth is. And that just means there's less that you can do to push that paper with a counter into the die. And so super fine details don't necessarily create a ton of impact in terms of embossing. So if embossing is the idea of taking a negative die and a positive counter and pushing the paper into the die, you'd assume that debossing is the opposite. And as far as the effect is concerned, that's the way people talk about it. But what people mean when they typically say debossing is just the act of letterpress printing without color. What's up? This is actually just a no color letterpress print. Now, letterpress, if you haven't seen before, when people say deboss, typically what they mean is a blind letterpress hit, which means taking a photopolymer plate like this, applying no ink, or in some cases, white ink. Either translucent ink if it's a darker paper or just plain old white ink, and creating an effect that looks something like this. This was a blind hit on dark paper. I happen to actually use a translucent white ink there just to darken it a little bit, but there's no color added to it. A much clearer example is one I showed you earlier, this one. There's nothing there but impression. In fact, there's so much impression in this one, and the old timers are going to kill me for this one, but there's so much impression that it just pops straight out the back. But what you'll notice is this is not a clear print of any sort in the back. The clear print is in the front because this is the thing that's designed to do the printing. There was apparently a version of debossing that used a die and a counter to push the paper in. The problem is, the reason we can't do that today is the counters we use are fiberglass or they're sculpted or whatever, but they're not hard-edged metal, the kind of thing that creates the crispness that allows for art like that. I mean, this is just, it pops, and you're not going to get that if you use the die on the wrong side. So when you order debossing, typically what you're getting is someone just doing a blind impression. And frankly, there are better ways to do a blind impression. Now, this one, it's a little tricky, but this is what a blind impression on a single ply cotton stock looks like. This is what doing clear ink with a copper die looks like on cotton paper. You'll see how much more impact that has for two reasons. One, the clear foil, I said ink before, didn't I? Foil. The clear foil allows for a change in texture. This is glossy versus matte, and that's part of what creates that powerful pop there. But the other thing is just simply the copper die has tighter edges to it. And so if you print, instead of using photopolymer, if you print with copper, if I had printed this without foil, it still would pop really well because I get down into the edges. I get nice clean lines there. Which brings me to another point about foil, embossing, all that stuff. That's best done on a heated press. Foil has to be done on a heated press because it's a combination of pressure, the length of the pressure, and the heat applied to it that allows foil to release. The nice thing about using the heat when we're doing embossing is it means that the heat will kind of iron out the paper. And when the paper deforms, the fibers will reset to their new position and kind of keep that as their memory instead of trying to go back to flat. So then you get things like this. And this is probably one of my favorites. This is a sculpted die for a wedding invitation this summer. And the level of detail that you can get in there, it's incredible. You really can get a ton of detail. You know, it's ultimately limited to how fine a CNC can go in that brass die. But the interesting thing is you don't get near the detail on the backside, which is why a deboss or deboss doesn't actually work well in the modern age. That has nowhere near the impact that does because you don't get the detail. And so when most people say deboss, what they actually mean is a blind hit of letterpress. I'm not a fan of really worrying about these terms with my clients. I will talk about raised or depressed or impressed surfaces. I think that's important for them to know kind of what the texture is going to look like. But the reality is, for me, I think the best solution is to get on press sometimes and see what is going to work best. You know, I knew that there was no need to do a sculpted emboss here, which could have rounded off the tops of these letters and given them some interesting shapes. That worked perfect for this particular project, whereas this done flat would have been horrible. It wouldn't have worked at all. And in this particular case, if you're going to do a combination die, it has to be sculpted so that we can cut out all the way around the die and allow that foil to release cleanly like that. Trying to see if I have any other pieces here worth showing. A couple other counters. This was actually the counter for that. You can see that there. Again, the die isn't here anymore, but this was the counter that pushed the paper into a die to create that knife shape, which is also why, by the way, you'll see the knife shape knocked out of this here, because I didn't want to put ink where the knife was going to be. It was going to mess it all up. So when people use the term deboss, take that with a grain of salt. Honestly, most of the people who say it, they don't know what it means. And frankly, I'm still not entirely sure what it means or how it was used or exactly what it looked like in a production process where people were actually doing it. But for clarity's sake, when I'm talking about these effects, I will talk about a blind impression, a white or clear impression, which means putting ink on it and still getting a little bit of that contrast, or we'll talk about foil. Because I think clear foil ultimately is probably the best solution 99% of the time if you're going for that depressed, impressed, debossed look. I think it's the better solution. However, there is nothing like a really beautiful emboss done properly. There's just something so cool about that texturally. I am always trying to find ways to talk about how to create better impact through stationery using the methods that are available to us. If you like this video, would you go ahead and hit like and subscribe? I'll even ask you to hit that notification bell if you want to get the next one. And again, if you have any questions, comments, put them down below. I'm sure to frustrate a lot of stationers with this one. They all use this term, and it's the wrong term. You don't deboss these things, you do a blind hit. It's a totally different effect and worth being clear about. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Thanks.